Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Tribal Youth Training and Technical Assistance Centers series on Tribal Juvenile Healing to Wellness Courts. Today we are talking about consequences and rewards, which are also known as sanctions and incentives, within the Tribal Juvenile Healing to Wellness Courts. So if that's where you're planning to be, you are in the right place. So we are going to open up real quick with an exercise, and my co-presenter, Courtney Yarholer, is here, and we want to just invite you all to participate if you want to.
Great. Good morning. Good afternoon, wherever you are on the globe. So thank you again for joining us today. Yeah, we'd like to just start in a way that we can all connect and come together. And you know, a lot of times what you might hear, we hear a lot about strategies. We join webinars. We hear a lot about tools, and which is great information in the context that we're sharing. However, we don't oftentimes. I want to take the time this morning, this afternoon, to connect and recognize why we're here. And so if you wouldn't mind, take a few moments to think about maybe that one person or that group of people that have helped you along in your journey up to this point in your life. Because more than likely you're here with the intention of bringing good things to young people, to our tribal youth. And we thank you for that work. But we know you didn't get here alone, and others have been involved with that. So you think about that. You think about who, maybe it would be a parent, a grandparent, aunt, uncle, a teacher, somebody in the community, a mentor of some kind. I know there may be many in your life. So what I'm going to ask you to do is think about how they made you feel. So how they made you feel, if you could sum that up, how that makes you feel in one word, if you could sum that up. I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves in the chat box by typing in their name, where they're from, and where they're calling in from, and then also include your word that comes to mind that describes of how they made you feel, that affirmation that you got. How did they make you feel? If you could take a few moments, and we'll ask everyone to share their word with everyone else. And I hope you...
I see people typing. Terry says enthusiastic.
Great.
Aaron says inspired. Greg, thank you, says teamwork.
And if you can include where you're calling in from as well, that would be helpful. That way everyone can see where everyone's across Indian country.
All right, so I know other people will type in as we go. Sarah, capable, Fort Belknap.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Thank you all for sharing. So what is your word, Courtney?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Thank you very much. Let's see. My word would have to be belonging. And so, belonged, is that a word? It'll be a word for today, belonged. Determination.
Thank you, Donna.
Great. So we'll continue on, and as we roll through the next few slides, if a word comes to you and you want to share it, please do so. Type it in, use the chat, because we want to share these, because this also not only is a reflection of what was given to you, the blessing that's been blessed upon you, but also it's an opportunity to share that with one another. And we can take this time to recognize the strength that has brought us here today.
Yes.
So
we want to take just a minute to introduce ourselves. My name is Anna Clough. I work here at the OJJDP Tribal Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center, and we are located in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And I am Muskogee Creek and Uchee, and I am from Oklahoma.
And hello, my name is Courtney Yarholer. I am Sac and Fox, Pawnee, Otoe, and Creek. I am the program manager here at the OJJDP Training and Technical Assistance Center. I have a master's in social work and have been working in the field with children's mental health and related issues for over close to 15 years now. And so it's my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon.
Thank you, Courtney. And I know many of you may have been in our previous 2 sessions, and my friend Natalie Stites, who works here at the center, she was on those first 2, and I asked Courtney to join today because we are talking about behavior change. We are talking about helping youth make better decisions for their life, and so I know with Courtney's experience that he would be really helpful to this conversation, so I'm glad that he was able to join us today. So today we're going to have a discussion about behavior modification. We're going to talk about strengths and needs of tribal youth. We're going to talk about the development of a system of consequences and rewards within a tribal juvenile healing to wellness court setting. And we're going to talk about how you can implement a process within your community and some of the factors that you might want to consider as you're working with your team to develop what kind of consequences and rewards that you want to implement within the court. So, and I want to pause right here for just a minute. Nick Birdshead, who's on our team, is going to give a quick tech review.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar today. To get started, if you have anything that you want to chat about with other members here, go ahead and feel free to use this little chat box right here. Please keep it focused on the webinar. Maybe if you have a little story or something that relates to what they're talking about, go ahead and put it on there. If you have any questions, please put those over here in the Q&A box. At the end of the webinar, we're going to go through and read each question and then answer them to the best of our ability. And then right here in the middle is the download box. It has today's presentation in PowerPoint and in PDF. Feel free to download those. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. All right, so we wanted to ask a couple questions here. So we want to get to know who's on the line. Are you a judicial services provider? Do you work in the courthouse? Do you work in another field? Are you going to be affiliated with the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court in a different way? We just want to know where everybody might be coming from. So do you work in behavioral health? Do you work in education? Are you on the advisory committee? We just want to know who's joining us today.
So if you could type your answers into the chat box, that would be great. I know that we have everyone's lines muted just so that we can continue to keep the conversation moving forward. But if you could join us in the chat box, that would be great. So we know that it takes a lot of people from around the community to impact the lives of our children. And so whatever your role is, we look forward to seeing that. We have an MDT facilitator and grant coordinator. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you. So we know we're going to have a few answers. We hope that whatever information we provide today is helpful to you, whatever role you're in. So let's get started. So the Tribal Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court is a problem-solving court. It's a branch off of probably what you think of as the drug court. However, it differs because it incorporates culturally integrative processes within the system, focusing on the needs of tribal youth who are engaged in delinquent behavior and suffer from addiction to alcohol or illegal substances. The purpose of the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court is broad. We want to increase individual and community safety. The Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court holds youth accountable for their behavior, but it really focuses on providing therapeutic processes within the system that are both culturally supportive and individualized. And so, you know, the purpose is twofold. One is to provide healing for the individual, but it's also to increase that long-term community safety. And so there are many benefits that come out of the successful completion or graduation from a Healing to Wellness Court case plan for these youth that are coming into it. This is a diagram that we feel like encompasses many of the aspects of a Healing to Wellness Court. However, because we know that communities differ, different aspects of things are going to be incorporated within the system. However, broadly, tribal custom, justice, intervention, and youth-focused activities are what go into a Healing to Wellness Court for tribal youth. So if you want to, when you download, you can get a copy of this diagram. I feel like it does do a good job of giving a broad overview of what components might be in a juvenile Healing to Wellness Court. So a few of you who have worked in the field a long time, or if you're just coming into the field, here is saying the words consequences and rewards rather than the term sanctions and incentives. And I wanted to just pause and have a short conversation about why we've chosen to use that terminology. So I think the language you use within the Tribal Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court is very important. Many of the courts that we work with and many of the existing wellness courts across the country, they use their own tribal language within the court system itself, but they're also using therapeutic language when they're conversing with participants. And so one of the things that I feel is important is that if you're working with youth, that the word sanctions to me is very harsh. I feel like it communicates that punitive style of language. And so, we've chosen as a center to use the phrase consequences and rewards. We're not saying that's what it should be, but we're saying that when you're developing the processes that you're using within the system, that you consider using language that you feel like communicates contributes to a therapeutic environment and also contributes to valuing the participant and understanding where they're coming from. And so we're not saying that this is the phrase that it should be. We're just saying this is what we like as a center and we want to communicate. And, you're free to use whatever descriptors you want.
Can I add to that, Anna?
Yes.
So just as Anna had mentioned, we hope that the language we're encouraging and recognizing best practice, that the language that we use, it really sets the framework of how we interact with the youth and how the youth perceives us as we're speaking about the situation. And, we find this across multiple sectors. I know drawing from my personal experience working in helping develop children's systems of care and mental health systems, children's mental health systems. At one time, we had tribal communities when they were receiving these mental health grants and were writing up code and how we're going to bill and all developing these different programs, mental health programs. One of the qualifiers to qualify for services is a child that had to be diagnosed with a serious mental disorder. And that terminology did not sit well with the community, and it certainly did not sit well with the child and the youth. And so that's, I know of communities that change that language, and they, the diagnosis may still reflect what was in the prescribed text. However, the way they refer to it within their actual system, they started changing the language and referring to their young people as sacred ones, the sacred children, or using words from their tribal language. So again, just that flip on language, it really sets a different tone and sets up a different framework. And so that's what we're hoping to accomplish with this kind of language. So.
Thank you, Courtney. So with that, let's move forward. I fully agree with that. Consequences and rewards or sanctions and incentives are strategies that are incorporated within the wellness court to support behavior change. They've been incorporated into both adult wellness courts as well as in standard juvenile drug courts. This includes the application of consequences and rewards to support behavior change, and they occur as the youth moves through the case process. And so this process of administering consequences and rewards will carry out throughout the case process until the youth graduates from the program.
And furthermore, on consequences and rewards, rewards or incentives are motivational tools that are given for positive increases and success throughout the case plan. Really what we're talking about here is affirmation. Affirmation. So the rewards can come in multiple ways. And we'll have a few slides where we'll talk about different examples of rewards. But underlining is this idea of affirmation. So we know the sense of accomplishment. I kind of want to refer back to, I know that there was a word that was shared within our group opener when we were talking about how does somebody make you feel that contributed to your success. Well, I know I shared the word belonging. And then we also had some other words shared as enthusiastic or inspired or determined. All of those are very affirming words and affirming statements and affirming feelings. So this is what we're hoping to get at when we're talking about rewards, so that the reward is meaningful, because the affirmation, the sincerity behind it is what's going to stick with the young people and build them up. So I just wanted to make that point in terms of rewards. In terms of consequences, they're used to encourage participants to comply with the Tribal Healing to Wellness Court case plan and general program policies. So again, we're still holding our young people accountable for their actions, but we're trying to be less punitive and be more strength-based. So there are always consequences, and that's a part of life and growing up, an opportunity to teach those life skills and those life lessons that, things don't always work out the way we want to, but then there's always going to be a consequence, a reaction for every action. Mm-hmm. And so this is an opportunity for learning and teaching. So that's how we look at consequences.
So we know that consequences and rewards are widely used within the wellness court and teen drug court setting. And if you want to learn more about adult wellness court and incorporation of sanctions and incentives, you can look at the Tribal 10 Key Components. That is listed under Key Component 6. So I know that many of the wellness courts that we work with have that resource, and so if you want to check that section of material out, that would be really helpful to the conversation. So why do we want to implement a system of consequences and rewards? Well, one of the main goals is to support the youth participant as they work toward a substance use-free lifestyle. And we also want to maintain accountability. And so when the youth are coming into the Tribal Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court, most likely they've either been court involved previously and they're being transferred into the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court, or maybe this is a referral from another service provider who's had ongoing contact with the youth. And so one of the most important things that we want to do is to support this youth within the system continuously, and part of that is, the accountability. And so when they come into the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court, it's, them agreeing that they're going to abide by case plans, they're going to follow the policies and procedures that you're putting before them, that they're going to follow the orders of the court, and maintain accountability to the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court team as they progress through the case plan. We also want to maintain cultural value as we implement a system of consequences and rewards. And so, for many communities, respecting traditional life ways is not engaging in substance use. It's not engaging in illegal activity. And so accountability to not engage in that behavior is vital, and this is the opportunity you have to teach those ways to these youth that are coming into the system.
I'll add to that, if you don't mind, but just to build on what Anna has already, the foundation that Anna has already laid for us here, in terms of accountability, And, I want to bring up another term that has been shared throughout, I know, our TA center as well as throughout the field. And it's how do we, and this is also a part of the Healing to Wellness efforts, is how do we become more trauma-informed? Trauma-informed, we look at trainings, we look at capacity in terms of staff and things like that. However, we can also look at trauma-informed practices and care and strategies and approaches in how we do what we do and why we're doing what we do. And what I mean by that is when we talk about accountability is also equal to, it's trauma-informed because it promotes stability, it promotes consistency, and it promotes healthy boundaries. So when we can show accountability by providing stability, consistency, and healthy boundaries, especially with working with youth that have risky behaviors or come from environments that are unpleasant and maybe in poverty or whatever the situations may be, these things of accountability are vital, and they're critical to the development and the support of a young person. And so again, that's stability, consistency, and healthy boundaries. So that speaks to the accountability. And so that in and of itself, when we begin to look at it and reframe it in our minds that way, then we can begin to start thinking in a more trauma-informed care way, because that consistency, that stability, that healthy boundaries is all a part of being trauma-informed. So, what do we know about consequences and rewards in the treatment court setting? So we know that incentives work. Here's a quote here from a study that was done in 2004. It's shown that incorporating rewards into drug court programs, it's possible to double the rates at which offenders make timely progress towards graduation, even for the most serious offenders. So, and then we also have another quote here: significant positive outcomes are reported for JDCs that model consistent and effective disciplinary practices. So why? My question is why? Why do incentives work? And why do we know this? And what it really comes back down to is that it's strengths-based. It's a strengths-based approach as opposed to a punitive approach. Mm-hmm. And so when we're strengths-based and we're building and recognizing the strengths and affirming healthy decision-making and healthy choices, that's how we build up and help. Like our image here, we're helping our young person up that hill. Mm-hmm. And before long, they'll be the person helping somebody else up the hill. But again, it comes back to incentives and affirmations.
So one of the things that is most important when you're developing a system of consequences and rewards is the effective use of team management. And so when your treatment court, your Healing to Wellness court is going to implement this system, it's really important for you to plan as a team. How are you going to monitor participant behavior, and how are you going to maintain that consistency? And so one of the ways that we see is very effective is developing those roles and responsibilities very early on. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to share this specific topic early on in the learning series, because when you're planning what kind of rewards and consequences system that you want to implement, if you are implementing that, you need to define within your roles and responsibilities, okay, who's going to be responsible for maintaining consistent contact with the youth when they're not in the courthouse. So, these are things that you need to plan ahead for. You need to plan early on. You need to work as a team on these are the processes that we want to implement, and here's the action items that we're going to do to make sure that we're going to have consistent contact with the youth. Right,
and I just kind of wanted to add again to that term consistency and kind of loop back around once again to this idea of being trauma-informed. And it kind of goes back to what was mentioned earlier as well, is that why is it trauma-informed? Why is consistency? Why is that trauma-informed? Because it's trauma-informed because it contributes to a sense of safety. And so again, safety being one of the tenets of trauma-informed care is that we need to help ensure a sense of safety for our young people that have been traumatized or going through situations that can be traumatizing. So that consistency also supports safety.
Mm-hmm. So I know we heard from a few of you earlier, but if you have a role within the Healing to Wellness Court, what is your role? And I know some people shared earlier. I'm seeing we have a tribal court coordinator that's joining us. We have court clerks. I've seen some of my programs that I've worked with. I know there's some judges on here. There's wellness court coordinators. So I'm glad to see that we have a lot of individuals that are working within the wellness court. All right, so let's look at the framework. There are a lot of considerations that go into how you're administering consequences and rewards. I chose some of the four big ones to focus on today. There's research that supports many other aspects of consequences and rewards, but it comes down to being graduated, immediate, fair, and individualized, and those are four of the core components that go into an effective consequences and reward system within the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court. So we're going to walk through all four of those and have a few examples here and there. So a graduated system of consequences and rewards are administered where harsher consequences are going to be later in the process. So when a youth comes into the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court, they're not going to have heavy sanctions right at the very beginning. One of the reasons is if you're administering some of the harshest consequences at the very beginning of treatment, you're probably going to run out of consequences before you ever get to a changing point in the youth's case. And so when the youth first comes in, they're just then becoming oriented within the Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court. Most likely, they've either just begun receiving treatment, if you're able to offer that as a service through the court, which my hope is that you will, since this is collaborative and it's a joint intervention. But they're right at the process of becoming oriented within the case. And so it's important at the beginning that it doesn't mean that there's no accountability. It just means that the consequences that are administered early on are probably not going to be as heavy as those that would be administered later in the case after they've had an opportunity to become engaged within the system and also receive the therapeutic care that they need to help with whatever addiction issues that they have. So an example of a graduated consequence is a youth participant comes in during phase 1 of the case process. They fail to attend school 2 days of the week without their parents' permission, and they show a positive UA. So one graduated consequence that could be administered is an earlier curfew and then increased screening or monitoring. And so instead of screening, one time every 3 days, you're going to move to every other day, or you're going to have a contact, instead of you doing 3 contacts a week unannounced, you're going to do 4 contacts that next week. And later, the same youth participant is in phase 3 of the case process. So by this time, they've begun to receive treatment, they're engaged in therapeutic processes, most likely they've begun to work with a counselor, maybe the team has had increased engagement with the youth. The same incident happens. They don't attend school for 2 days of the week. They show a positive UA. So the graduated consequence at that time is going to be heavier. Maybe you move to home detention. Maybe you increase screening. Maybe you shift them back to a prior phase. So basically they're moving backwards in time in the case because of the decision that they made. So there's a differing range of applied consequences based on their level within the process. And, this is really going to be individualized at the point in time that whatever behavior occurs. But it's to give them time to become acquainted and to not be as harsh right at the start, is what it comes down to.
And so also, let me ask you, Anna, it also sounds like, in phase 1 as opposed to somebody in phase 3, you kind of have to get used to the process and getting to know the process. And by phase 3, they should have a better idea and understanding of what to expect.
Right.
So.
Right. And I think that goes down to engagement level.
Mm-hmm.
How engaged is the youth within the case? Are they regularly complying? Is it ongoing? So there's many factors that could come into play on what kind of consequence is administered later, but it's going to come down to that individualized approach for administering consequences.
So again, I want to make a note, because it sounds like that when we approach it this way, is that we're already, the assumptions have shifted from a traditional court to a healing to wellness court. And the assumptions being that as a young person has the ability to make good, healthy decisions if given all of the information.
Right.
And whereas we know traditional court, it may come from a whole different perspective.
Right.
So this not new perspective, but this perspective is really having a little bit of faith and growing the faith in the young person that they can make good and healthy choices.
Right. And I think it builds trust for the participant to know that there are going to be consequences for the behavior, but these consequences aren't to punish. I've said this before. I really like, the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges. One of the tenets that they share is that the consequence isn't to punish, it's to identify the need. And so what are the needs at that point, and what can we do to intervene, and how can we help? So even when we're administering a consequence, it isn't to punish, it's to support them and where they're at and what are the needs. So when this same youth in phase 3 is still having the same behavior issue, what are we missing? What have we missed, and how can we help, and how can we intervene better?
I think that's a great transition. So I think that's a great transition into this next slide and our coming slides. When we get to the more individualized area. In terms of the immediate application, we know that studies show that the effectiveness of the sanction or incentives declines dramatically as the length of time between the behavior and the response increases. Basically, the research tells us that the sooner the reward or affirmation, the more impactful it is. Also, we know that when those affirmations are sincere and they're coming from a place from an individual or a team that is working with this youth, and that sincerity is consistent over time, and is immediate. It's immediate. That's going to be more impactful for the youth, and that helps build them up and helps get to some of those things that we mentioned earlier when we open that sense of belonging and affirmation. So.
Right, and I like this quote from Houston that said, we know that this is important, especially for those who are going to return to the same environment. And so being able to implement that, we're talking a lot about consequences right now, but even the rewards. So when we know that they've made progress and that they are, maybe they progressed to a new phase in the case, they've had clean UAs, they've been doing great in school, that we're acknowledging that, as soon as possible. And so that they feel that feeling of affirmation as quickly as possible, and that we note that ongoing. So, that immediacy is very important.
It goes back, again, back on your quote here, those that are going back to the same troubled environments, it reinforces that, again, that sense of safety, that consistency, and that structure that our young people need. And
So if we're going to have an immediate application of rewards and consequences, that's going to require your team to have a plan on how they're going to be implemented prior to the acceptance of youth within the Juvenile Healing and Wellness Court. And I know that one of the courts that we work with, they're court probation officer has made it very clear that, they don't shut off their phone at 5 o'clock and go home and sit and hang around. They have a very coordinated plan on who's on call, who's making visits that week, who's doing drop-ins, who's calling the teacher that week to make sure, have they been at school every day? Because maybe mom and dad don't know. Maybe grandma or grandpa, who's caregiver, doesn't know if they've gone to school every day that week. And so it requires a coordinated team effort to see if we have, school days are going well, home is going well, caregiver is giving a good report, caregiver is not giving a good report for this week. And so as a team, you need to look at how you're going to coordinate that ongoing engagement and how are you going to target and support the youth as they move through their case process. And so we always want to be mindful of that early on. I know that many of the courts that are just coming in, that just got funding, you're just starting your policies and procedures. And so, my hope is that this information will help you shape and it'll guide some of the plans that you're making.
So we want to take a moment here to engage and ask you all some questions, maybe of things that you are doing or that you're considering in terms of the immediate application of rewards and consequences. So let me just ask, and you can share your answers in the chat box, and we'll keep going as well. But what is your monitoring systems? What monitoring systems will be in place for you to support youth in their compliance of their plan? So.
Right, and I know that regularly there'll be scheduled drop-ins at school. There might be drop-ins at home. You may have a probation officer that does that. You may have somebody on your team that you designate in that role. I know that we like to use the word mentor instead of monitor sometimes. Mm-hmm. But that is an aspect of that continuing process to make sure you know what is happening in the life of the youth participant.
How will you check in with the youth?
Right. How are you going to check in? I know that, we don't necessarily have standing on any certain way of monitoring, but I know that there are court systems that do implement, ankle monitors and other ways of, ensuring that they know where the youth is. That's up to your community. That's a real individual decision within the community of how you're monitoring, how you're tracking, this youth isn't supposed to have contact with this person. How are you maintaining consistency in knowing whether that's occurring? So second question is, is your team going to effectively plan for scheduling court dockets? And so one of the ways to engage with the youth is that regular visit within the court system. And are you scheduling those court dockets around the youth schedule? Are you having an evening court docket? Are your court dockets going to be at the same time each week so that the youth is being excused from school to come there? These are things that you should think of ahead of time if you're just now developing your system. And if you're already a wellness court that is serving youth, feel free to share how you plan your court docket so that you have regular, ongoing contact with the youth participants.
So I just wanted to take a moment and read Anthony's comment here, where he shared. He said, he just learned that consequences can be unintended, but results are intended. And results from UAs can be that UAs are for clean results, not dirty. Which fosters trust. And it sounds to me like this next part really explains it here, that when the child is asked if they can provide a clean test, we give them the UA. If they say they can't give a clean UA, then you document it as self-reporting. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great way to approach that, Anthony, and I thank you for sharing that. Because again, it's in how we frame things and how we get this information and how we're engaging with the young person.
Yes. I really appreciate you sharing that, Anthony, because, I know that's one of the terms for those of us who have worked as prosecutors, and myself, I've worked as a prosecutor. For those who've been working in the court system for a long time, we know that, there's those terms like dirty and you're hot. I know that it's easy to throw those terms around as practitioners, but when you're working with the youth participant, I think that's such a great approach to not make them feel further stigmatized from, something that they're working to overcome. So once they've made the decision to come into a wellness court setting, they are making a decision to become engaged and to really work toward a clean lifestyle, and so I really appreciate that. We have a couple of other comments about juvenile detention over the weekend. Courtney, can you read that?
Michelle says, currently our probation officer monitors our juveniles by way of going to the schools and conducting random UAs. In addition, if the juvenile does not comply with the program, the juvenile is lodged into juvenile detention over the weekend.
Right. And so, we definitely, we want the youth to know that there are consequences. So, this is about accountability. It is about that environment of safety and trust, and that's one of the things if we're talking about like a parent-child relationship, it's that not breaking trust. So I trust that you're going to comply with the case plan. I trust that you're going to work toward these goals that you're setting for yourself. And when those things don't happen, there are going to be consequences on the other side. And I still feel, that detention may be that last resort, but at some point that could be a possibility. And so, we know that the youth know that this, making the right decisions and compliance is the best that they can do. When that doesn't happen, that the consequences can become, more harsh over time.
I'd say that that's also a good transition into our next question. It says, how will your team work with caregivers to support the effective implementation of a consequence? And what I glean out of that question and in that previous discussion is that when we're working with a young person and we're sharing with them the expectations, that one way that we can support the effectiveness of the implementation of the consequence is that it's clarified, and that the young person knows in advance what the expectations are and the consequence of not the consequences as well. So being clear in our communication and making sure that the young person understands. So let's go to the lines, if you will. What are some other ways that your team works with the caregivers to support effective implementation of a consequence?
Right, and we know that if the negative behaviors are coming from home, I see a question here, are there programs for the family and parents? And so really that is a barrier that happens in, the juvenile drug court setting, in the juvenile wellness court setting. It is difficult sometimes to overcome problems when the problems are occurring within the home. However, if your court can focus on that caregiver engagement, increasing caregiver engagement, there also are reward systems that do provide rewards for the whole family. And so when a goal or a phase is accomplished, the reward might be a gift card or some other something else that contributes to the family as a whole. So when the youth is increasing in positive behavior, that there's a benefit derived for the family. Now, we know that there are environments that are just not healthy, where it is a difficult environment to deal with, and I think that just comes down to that team coordinated contact with the youth, increased support for that youth, engaging the youth as best possible, and identifying what those barriers are at home and communicating about them regularly. Because we know in smaller communities where cousin or brother or whoever else is the one that might be drawing that youth in to engage in the behavior, it almost might seem like an impossibility, but really the youth's individual choice to engage is what we're getting at, because it's their decision at the end of the day as to what behaviors they're going to choose to engage in. So my hope is that your team will have somebody that's passionate enough, that really wants to be there for these youth participants that are in your court to meet that need if that's, some problem that's going to have to be overcome.
I just, Harley, I believe is your name, that's a great question and a great point, and I think from the perspective of a technical assistance provider, I would like to pose that question to the field and everybody on the call. Like, what are some effective ways that you have approached this area in terms of family, parents, and caregivers? And, I think that that's a broader conversation that we can continue, and I hope that we will in another format. But thank you for asking that question.
Right, and I like what Elise is saying here. We are allowing our youth to have an input, and yes, that is one of the best things that you can do is, invite the youth to speak to what's important to them, and then what would they acknowledge, as a substantial consequence for behavior.
I think that's a good transition to our next slide in terms of being fair.
Right, so we know that the wellness court, it isn't just like the juvenile drug court. The juvenile drug court is a Western model. The healing to wellness court really is individualized within the tribal community. And so when we talk about fairness, I wanted to acknowledge that, the Western ideal of fairness may be different, not substantially, but different than a tribal community idea of what fairness is. And I know that many of our communities like to talk about seeking balance, seeking harmony. And so are the consequences and rewards that you're giving, do they meet the values of fairness and equity within your community? And so when you talk about fair application, you want to look at what does this mean for my people within the framework of this court. What are we implementing that's going to support individual and tribal community values of fairness and equity?
So in terms of fair application of rewards and consequences, perception of unfairness can have especially serious consequences, and we know this, especially working with youth. A sense of unfairness can include defiance. Instead of refraining the youth, may purposely repeat the behavior. So, yeah, we know that to be, from experience, I think any of us that have worked with children, or maybe even have children, recognize whenever there's a sense of unfairness, we can get even more negative results and behavior from that. So again, balance is needed between the rewards and the consequences within a treatment court. And research indicates that there should be 4 incentives for every 1 sanction. I think that that's a good indicator. I wouldn't say it's the rule, but I would say it's something to keep in mind. Because, again, it contributes to that balance. And I think it's a good measure, but it's not necessarily the rule that we need to stick by. However, we want to be aware of that balance. And again, fairness being individualized and based off of the unique needs. And it's just kind of wanted to make one more point that it's critical that it must be strength-based. When our rewards and consequences are viewed from a strengths-based perspective, that also supports the application of fair application as well. So.
So an effective system of consequences and rewards is going to promote the youth to be responsible, to be accountable for his or her actions, while allowing them to complete their program. And so what you want is the continued acknowledgement of progress, as well as acknowledgement when there is that noncompliance. But ultimately, the hope of the court is that each of these youth will graduate and will come to a point in their life where they're not turning to substances, that they are moving towards a lifestyle that is free from substances, they're not engaged in the delinquent behavior that they may have been engaged in before, and that ultimately they are able to complete the plan. And so earlier when we talked about, that ratio of rewards to consequences, we don't want the youth to consistently feel defeated, and we know that they're trying to overcome, significant barriers. And so the hope is that they will move towards completion and that the processes you've implemented are supporting them to do that. They come into the Healing to Wellness Court with different strengths, different needs, different backgrounds.
Right.
What you're implementing is going to take these differences into account. What resonates with one youth may not resonate with another. Maybe you have a younger youth versus, an older youth who's maybe been court involved previously. There's going to be differences in how you approach, but at the same time remaining consistency across the board. So really this is coming down to your team and your judicial leadership really focusing on how can we be fair, how can we administer a system of consequences and rewards that meets the needs of all these youth, and how can we explain our reasoning behind a specific consequence or reward so that no youth leaves feeling like they've been treated unfairly. And, that comes down to individual perception, but I think when you're making the effort to be fair and to be balanced, that hopefully that comes across to your youth that are in your system.
And I just want to say that you've done a great job of outlining this individualized application of rewards and consequences. It does have to be individualized. I know we work systematically. However, when we can create our systems to be individualized, we get greater results. And it's more impactful for the young person. There's a conversation going on over here in the chat box that I wanted to highlight. I think it's great in terms of, it started off with saying that we I think it was Alyssa, I can't see up that high, but she said that the young people are involved in the decision making of what the consequences and what the rewards are going to be, and that helps the buy-in and the engagement of the young person. It also helps build that trust because we're showing that we have enough trust in that young person. Maybe nobody's ever had trust in them, and give them that opportunity to share what they think is important. And so by doing that, it really shows that value that you have for the young person, and it builds the trust. There's also a comment that is very important that we need to pause for a moment. And Ethylene Ironcloud, Two Dogs, thank you very much for bringing this up, that we do know that developmentally our young people's brains are still developing up into their mid-20s. And especially if a young person has partaken in risky behaviors such as using alcohol or other drugs, we know that could stunt the development of the neurological development of a child's brain. And so they may not have the mental capacity to fully engage in decision making. And so sometimes we might need to help and step up that piece a little bit more, again, which goes back to this individualized approach. Mm-hmm. So recognizing that every individual comes with, like Anna said, they come with their strengths, they come with their challenges, and they come with all their different personalities. Mm-hmm. And so thank you, Ethylene, thank you, Alyssa, for having that conversation. I think it's really great for all of us to hear. So.
Right, so exactly what we've been talking about. It's an individualized system. We want to continuously engage with the youth, and one of the ways that you can best meet the needs of your youth is conferring regularly as a team. So when you know as a team this is the approach that we probably need to take with the youth, that is so helpful to you because one, it bolsters that team support and approach. And then it also shows the youth, we're agreeing as a team that this is the next best step in your case. And so, working toward everything we've already said, identifying the strengths and the needs of the individual youth participant, and basing consequences and rewards specifically to that youth. So I want to move to a few examples and some resources that you might check out. When we talk about rewards, verbal praise, recognition in court, reduced supervision, trips and other activities, sports gear, equipment, lessons, small and large tangible rewards, electronics, games, and tickets. These are all differing kinds of rewards that can be given throughout the case process. There are a few resources that you can check out. I've put the links below, and if you download the presentation, you can go to both of those links. There's some very large list of incentives and rewards that you can review and look at as a team.
One thing that Alyssa points out is that on their intake form, they ask about hobbies and sports and things that they may like, and it gives them an opportunity to tell us about themselves. And so what that does, from what it sounds like, is it really helps create this kind of a list, and it's more person-centered, a person-centered list of options that is going to be meaningful for that young person. So.
Right. And I chose to share here categories because I really feel like what's available to you and your community may differ wildly from, a tribal community that's halfway across the country. And so I tried to stick to some broad categories here. And when you go to these websites here that are focused on, these are focused on both adult and juvenile drug courts, but, there are things that pertain to youth. I think it's important to look at those and see, is there something that's similar to that that's located in my community, or is that something I have access to?
And again, it goes back to what's going to motivate and then what's going to affirm. So those messages of affirmation, because everything that we do, whether we give a gift card or we give a trip to where, I don't know, a trip somewhere, there's a message that the young person is getting along with that. And so we have to think about that. Is our message affirming their positive actions, and is it motivating for their behavior change?
Right. So consequence examples are basically the vice versa of verbal praise is verbal admonishment, acknowledgement by the court that there was an act of noncompliance. There can be increased supervision, loss of privileges. Some communities have essays that are assigned for the behavior that was identified, community service, home detention, fines and fees, and then lastly, confinement or even termination from the program. So I listed that last, the termination from the program, because, as we said before, the hope is that the youth will ultimately graduate from their program. But in some instances, maybe they're not ready. Maybe there's just too much noncompliance, and they're not successfully meeting what's required of them within the case. And so ultimately, there could be termination from the program. And if this youth has come in, as a referral off of another case, or this was kind of their probationary chance, now they're going to move back into a regular juvenile case, I think that should be identified as, this is your opportunity. Once you're terminated from the case, it doesn't mean they couldn't come back into the wellness court, but that's a pretty significant punishment to me, a consequence, is termination from the program, but that is an option.
So I will say, there's a comment here by Anthony, and it sounds like there's using some logic here to talk about consequences, unintended, and results being intended, and negative and positive. Well, before we even go down that road, there's a word that Anna had just said that really talks about with the choices, and it really talks about these are options, these are opportunities. So consequences and rewards are opportunities. So when we see it as an opportunity, and the young person, and we help the young person understand that they have an opportunity within their decision making to be rewarded or to be have a consequence. There's always going to be a consequence to your action whether it be affirming or affirming that, hey, we made a poor choice, so next time, what choice are you going to make? So it's not a all or nothing. It's always an opportunity. So everything, every choice, every instance is an opportunity for us to help that young person grow.
Right, and if you weren't able to join at the beginning of the webinar, but you're on now, I know that question about, the language we're using the word consequence, and we know that generally, consequence can have, there can be good consequences and there can be negative consequences. In the context of this webinar, we're using consequences as, this is the result when there's noncompliance. Your community can choose whatever language. You can use the word sanction and incentive. You can use the word consequence and reward. You can use whatever is meaningful to your program and your youth as, this is the resultant activity that comes from noncompliance. And so we don't generally have any, here's the final word, here's what it must be. We're just sharing with you, here's a word that we're using instead of sanction. So when you're considering developing your list of rewards, verbal praise is a very high honor. Don't overlook the value of verbal praise. Studies and research show that is a very beneficial way to engage with the youth, is to communicate positively with them when they're in the court. When you have a concern about cost for rewards, maybe you implement a prize system where they earn a prize over time. So they're still getting that positive reinforcement, but you're not doling out a reward every single time they're in court. Look to donations and gifts from your tribal partners. I know that it can be difficult to maintain, some of these systems, but sharing with your community that this is the effort we're making. Do you have anything you can contribute towards these youth? That would be, something your team could do. Another approach is the fishbowl, where a prize is drawn from a bowl. Entries are based on rewards, and that's almost like the point system where, they're given a certain number of entries based on their behavior, and then they have the opportunity to draw from the fishbowl at a certain point in time. And it really just comes down to how creative can your team be to get rewards. So, this comes down to creativity, and I know there was a couple questions. I saw a question about purchases, and I want to refer you to your individual program manager if you're on federal funds. Communicating with your program manager about purchases is what I would refer you to.
But in terms of being creative, we have a couple of comments here. One is asking if we can give traditional awards such as a dancing rattle or an item that they could use in their traditional dances, or that's wonderful. If it's meaningful to the young person and is able to connect that meaning, that is a creative way to engage that young person. As well as an example was offered up to service with in the community, maybe service to elders or something else that promotes the community value. And then in terms of that implementation and approach, Ms. Ethelene Ironcloud also mentioned that when we address youth in kinship terms, that can give a sense of well-being as well. We see that as well, so thank you, Ethelene, for including that. So youth understanding of rewards and consequences. So a list of consequences and rewards should be provided to the youth at the orientation stage of their case process. And that's, a best practice only because it promotes a sense of safety in that they understand what is there. They understand what's in front of them. And we do our best to lay it out. And we know that we may not know every turn and everything that's coming down, but we can do our best to prepare and help prepare that young person. Again, that leads us to this area of being trauma-informed because it provides a sense of safety. And when somebody, an individual knows what to expect, that contributes to their sense of safety.
Mm-hmm. And I think that understanding also contributes to that sense of fairness. Mm-hmm. So they understand you communicated well, They know and understand that this is the outcome for when I'm not compliant, and this is the outcome for when I am compliant. And so, having that sense of understanding early on is really important. We wanted to talk a little bit about, what if what you're implementing isn't having the effect you thought? And so you can alter your list based on case outcomes. And just looking at the resultant behavior of the youth participants is one way to gauge if the reward or the consequence that you're giving is that effective.
Mm-hmm. And again, everybody's different. So, but if you're consistently seeing something over and over that is not effective, then where our services are there to be modified and changed, and for what we call quality improvement. You can call it whatever you want, but basically we're trying to make things better for our young people, our youth.
So consideration that we've talked about is identifying your monitoring processes early on, looking at your team capacity, identifying roles and responsibilities, engaging your tribal program partners, if you haven't already, but looking to your police, your probation, your drug and alcohol testing and screening providers. You're going to have to be fully engaged with the youth participants to really implement an effective system, and you're going to have to look at consequences and rewards that are effective and applicable within your tribal community. As well, are you identifying cultural protocols, some of the things that we've talked about? Is that reward that you're giving, it's meaningful to the community, and is it going to instill honor and respect and unity within the group between the youth participant and the Healing to Wellness Court team? So I think that's a great idea. Giving a gift that's meaningful from your community to a youth is really, I think, a great way to give a reward within the Healing to Wellness Court. So with that, we're going to do a little bit of review and wrap up. If you have any questions, go ahead and start typing those because we're just about to get there. But implementing your effective system of rewards and consequence processes has shown to increase graduation and completion rates. So what we're talking about today, this isn't required of you. Having an extensive system of consequences and rewards, your court is unique. It can be what meets the needs of your tribal youth, but implementing an effective system of consequences and rewards is helpful to youth who are in the system. If you're going to implement them, they should be immediate, fair, and individualized, and they should be known by the youth at orientation or very early on in the case. There are a lot of lists of consequences and rewards that you can look to, including those that we included as resources. But those that you choose for your community should be based on what meets the needs and individual values of your community.
Might I also add that as you're developing your programs and your approaches and your lists, utilize your resources that are available, your planning resources. Maybe if you have a community advisory or an advisory committee or youth that have been through the system before, get their input and have them contribute to these ideas and to this list and what this whole process should actually look like, because experience brings us a lot. And so don't forget to engage your community in that way.
See, we have a conversation about the language that we're using in the court. One is I see this example of telling them that they're problem solvers and that they've been solving problems for 13 years. I really love that. The whole point of the Healing to Wellness Court environment is that it vastly differs from a traditional court setting where, the aspects are generally punitive in nature. I know that juvenile courts across the board, they do focus on rehabilitation, but there's always that punitive ideology behind it.
There's always that gotcha.
Right. And the Healing to Wellness Court is an environment that can be completely different than that. It can be a place of safety. It can be a place of healing, and I think it's what your team makes of it.
Right.
So what you're putting into it, you're going to get out. If there are any questions, we're here at the end. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free to type those in. I thank everybody who has been typing so far. We appreciate that feedback and that dialogue. One of the questions that I talked to Courtney about was if you are in a tribal community and you are providing healing to wellness court services, are there rewards or consequences that you see in a juvenile drug court setting that either you don't have access to or that are difficult to implement within your wellness court? So if you have a comment on that, please feel free to type that in. I would love to hear, if the list that you see, if examples that you see or have been shared don't resonate with your community, what's the reason behind that? Is it access? Is it cost? What are the ways that your communities have worked to overcome, inaccessibility or cost or ongoing sustainability?
So as people begin typing their questions, we're going to stay on and we're going to continue to answer questions. But before we go too far into that, I wanted to remind everybody and ask everyone to please go out in your lower left-hand corner of your screen. There's a link to the webinar survey, and that's the survey of this webinar. We look at every one of those, and we really utilize your input to make our webinars and our trainings better, because we want to improve. We want to do that quality improvement as well, and we can only do that with your input. So we appreciate that. We thank you for filling out the survey, and we ask that you please do that for us. And everybody that fills out the survey, I will put an extra handful of cedar on the fire next time I'm offering my prayers for you. So, but yeah, definitely, we do appreciate your input and look forward to it.
Right, and I saw before, but we have people that are talking about kinship terms, utilizing kinship terms within the court system. Yes, that is a great way to bolster that trust and engagement with the youth participant. I know that some people are having to jump off, but if anyone has any questions, we're going to stay on for a little bit. If you have to leave, I want to tell you thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you being here, and I'm thankful for Courtney. He was able to join today, so thank you, Courtney, for joining us on the webinar. We'll leave it open. I have a question here. The webinar from the last PowerPoint, Donna, if you will message me your email, I can send that to you. If you want to, I don't know if you can private message me or not. If you type your email address, then we can get it to you.
Our contact information is here under the presenter contact information, and you can email myself or Anna, and we'll make sure that we get that to you. Also, on this presentation, if you download this presentation, just like the other ones, there are additional resources on the slides, and so be sure and see those resources if you want to look at those.
Right.
But, those are available.
At the end of the PowerPoint, our Tribal Youth TTA Center email is on there. If you have questions or comments that you think of later, we are here. You can email us. We will respond to you. We can get you resources. We can follow up one-on-one, and we are happy to do that. So if there's a question you didn't feel comfortable asking today, or if you think of something later, please feel free to email us. The email is on the last page of the PowerPoint.
And as we get ready to close out and go our separate ways for the afternoon, I wanted to reflect on something that was shared during the presentation, and Anna said it really eloquently, I thought, is the programs, they are what we make them. So like many things in life, they are what we put into it and what we make them, and however we want them to look, operate, and impact our young people, they are what we make them. Mm-hmm. So all of our hopes, our dreams, Our support from a TA center is with you. If you have any questions or want any further TA, please reach out to the TTA Center. And again, our contact information